Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the first great strike in American history, which happened among railroad workers and others in 1877. The strike involved 100,000 workers at a time when the population was one-tenth of what it is now and shut down the entire country. Dozens of people were killed, hundreds were injured, and the damages reached into the millions. Miles of train cars were set on fire, overturned, or derailed, and countless buildings were torched or demolished. It's an event that had very far reaching consequences on our nation's history. The unique aspect of this strike is that it happened virtually spontaneously. Strikes were organized locally, but there was no nationwide coordination. The country's workers were so fed up with being mistreated and exploited that once it began, there was a chain reaction across the entire nation. Countless trades came out in solidarity with the railroad workers, and the public threw their full support behind them, coming out to feed the strikers and join them in protest. Altogether, it lasted for 52 days before the military was finally able to suppress it in all areas. There are many factors that caused this event, not the least of which was the rapid industrialization that began to accelerate before the Civil War. Railroad, coal, and mining began replacing agriculture as the country's largest industries. Those who were before able to make a living with a trade were not able to compete with the large corporations and were forced to close up shop and go to work as a disposable cog in the industrial machine. The railroad industry grew at an astonishing pace, especially during the war when they had to be used for supply lines. Between 1868 and 1873, 33,000 miles of new track were laid. Those looking to capitalize on this growing industry poured money into it at such an absurdly high rate they crashed the economy, caused the Great Depression of 1873. Railroad magnates became so powerful that they bought politicians, the media, and the courts. This is where the term being railroaded originated. Many of the workers were forced to live in decrepit housing that was owned by the industrialists, who would charge them exorbitantly high rent fees. The workers were paid in scrip rather than cash, which could only be used at the company stores, where they marked up the price of basic living supplies at crazy high margins. Of course, during this depression, the corporations didn't want to pay their shareholders, who do nothing but sit back and collect a check, any less, and instead began cutting their workers' pay. The workers were already living below subsistence levels before these pay cuts, so now it was going to be guaranteed that they and their families would be starving and drowning in debt. All of the large railroad companies met on May 15th and decided to simultaneously cut their workers' pay by 10%. The workers' leaders responded with warnings. If this happened, they would stop working and go on strike, but the industrialists refused to negotiate. After 3 straight cuts of 10% by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the first strike began in Baltimore, Maryland, on July 16th, and then later that same day in Martinsburg, West Virginia. In the following days, the strike spread to Boston, St. Louis, Louisville, New York, Texas, Chicago, Ohio, and all the way as far as San Francisco. For the first few days, the protests were entirely peaceful, but still the corporations refused to negotiate and instead began calling in police and militias to break up the strikes. Just as the strike had begun in Baltimore, the violence began there as well. On July 20th, a protester threw a rock at the police and they began firing into the crowd. 3 people were killed, including a 14-year-old newspaper boy who had been working to support his invalid mother. His brains were blown out, as one report put it. Violent clashes continued throughout the night. By the next day, 10 civilians were dead, 40 were seriously injured, and Baltimore was under military rule. The entire government, along with the corporations, were hostile to the strikers. The media was against them as well. I'm going to read all of the insults that were thrown at the protesters in just one issue of the New York Times. Disaffected elements, roughs, hoodlums, rioters, mob, suspicious looking individuals, bad characters, thieves, blacklegs, looters, communists, rabble, labor reform agitators, dangerous class of people, gangs, tramps, drunken section men, lawbreakers, threatening crowd, bummers, ruffians, loafers, bullies, vagabonds, cowardly mob, bands of worthless fellows, incendiaries, enemies of society, reckless crowd, malcontents, wretched people, loudmouth orators, rapscallions, brigands, robbers, mob, riffraff, terrible fellows, felons, idiots. Other newspapers went even further, calling for mass bloodshed and the wholesale slaughter of the workers. The worst violence happened in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest company the country had ever seen and employed 50,000 workers along its 6,600 miles of train track. On top of the wage cuts, they announced on July 16th that the workers were going to move to double headers, where two cars would be stacked on top of each other. This meant that half of the workforce was going to be laid off, and the other half would have double the workload of very dangerous work. Double headers killed or maimed workers with shocking frequency. Working on the railroad in general was the most unsafe occupation in the country. If one of them was killed or got their fingers chopped off, they would simply be replaced. No health benefits were offered. In fact, the workers were forced to sign contracts that said the railroad companies would not be liable if they were harmed on the job. Not only did the trains kill workers, they also killed citizens by the thousands, disrupted their once quiet streets, scared their horses. Most likely, just about everybody would have known somebody who had been killed by a train at that time. On July 21st, the Philadelphia militia began shooting into the crowd in Pittsburgh, killing 20 people in cold blood. Once the news of these killings spread, the population went mad. They burned 39 buildings, destroyed 100 locomotives, 46 passenger cars, and 1,200 freight cars, and looted everything they could get their hands on. The militia was driven into a building and surrounded by angry protesters. 20 more were killed when the troops decided to shoot their way out. In Chicago, beginning on July 25th, fights raged on for days, the most deadly of which is known as the Battle of the Viaduct. 10,000 strikers gathered at the viaduct at Halstead and were charged by police. When the strikers began running away, the police shot them in the back, enraging them. Like most battles during this strike, you had one side throwing rocks and the others firing rifles indiscriminately. This battle lasted for a half hour, and when it was all over, 30 strikers were dead, 100 were wounded, and 13 police officers were slightly injured. This pattern repeated itself, city after city, nationwide. Finally, on September 4th, it was all over. 117 people were dead, hundreds were injured, thousands were jailed, and 5 million of property had been destroyed. Labor had suffered a crushing defeat. Most returned to work without their pay cuts rescinded, and the companies did all that they could to punish them for their insolence. The leaders were blacklisted. Many were brought to trial for inciting a riot. Capitol went to work drafting anti-labor laws that would outlaw picketing and charge strikers as criminal conspirators. They made agreements among themselves to fire and blacklist union members and began beefing up the national military, stationing them strategically so they could suppress future domestic disturbances. Labor became much more class conscious after this incident. The lesson they took away is that they needed to become better organized. We will talk about that in part 2. And that is the story of the Great Uprising of 1877. So, thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this introductory video, and I hope that you stick around my channel. This story, which I'm going to tell in 7 parts, is going to get a lot more interesting as it goes along. Many of the privileges that we take for granted today were hard won over many decades by countless men and women who went through hardships that we could hardly even imagine. We're going to hear about thousands of them who were killed, injured, or lost their livelihoods. In many cases, they were massacred in cold blood by corporate-hired police, military, and private detectives, not one of which ever saw a day in prison, of course, for these murders. This history is very important, yet they don't even spend one day teaching it to us in school. Wonder why that is. In part 2, we're going to discuss the Great Railroad Strike of 1886, which is even bigger than the one that we discussed today, and the Haymarket Affair, which is one of the most important events in labor history. So, I hope you all are doing well, and I will talk to you soon.